G'day viewers. In just over a couple of weeks, track and field will commence at the Tokyo Olympic Games. Without doubt, the biggest issue after whether the world's greatest track event would actually go ahead due to the COVID-19 pandemic has been the new shoe technology. In April last year, we reported on the World Athletics new shoe rules that were introduced to regulate against a mechanical advantage being obtained from footwear.
The instigate for this were complaints due to international road running records being obliterated as a result of the Nike Breaking 2 technologies that included more responsive foams along with strategic placement of carbon fibre plates to optimise running efficiency. These new rules regulated against midsole thicknesses and the use of carbon fibre and rigid plates in the shoes, and also the use of prototype shoes in competition. However, these rules protected only against the current models at the time, hence still provided scope for manufacturers to optimise a new approach to footwear design, not only as a protector of a foot, but as a mechanical aid. Since then, these new technologies have carried across to track spikes, and it led our guest today, Geoff Burns, postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Michigan, to state on the world's most prominent and influential running website, letsrun.com, in January this year, that 2021 on the track would look like 2018 on the roads. And it's definitely looking that way, with many international, national and collegiate records being broken in the last 6 months.
We will now cross over to Geoff, who is in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where he is not only an esteemed researcher in running biomechanics, he is a former USA champion and representative in ultramarathon running, 50 and 100 kilometre events, but is also immersed in the world of elite distance running at the home of the very nice track club under coach Ron Warhurst. Okay, Geoff, thanks very much for your time this morning here and evening there.
Yeah, good morning.
Big question that we want to ask you about is with the super shoes. Now, the editorial that sort of rose into prominence in the British Journal of Sports Medicine in October 2019, is it the shoes? A simple proposal for regulating footwear in road running. In this, you recommended that midsole thickness be capped at 31 millimetres. However, World Athletics have allowed a 40 millimetre sole thickness at the moment. And in regard to track spikes, World Athletics have regulated sole thickness at 25 millimetres in events over 800 metres and 20 millimetres in events below.
So I'm sure, you know, when you brought out that article, it made a big difference in your life, gained a lot of traction. And I guess one thing that a lot of people are keen to understand is in terms of the midsole thickness, why did you propose 31 millimetres? And do you feel like the current regulations are appropriate in terms of balancing performance while allowing continued innovation in shoe technology?
Yeah, great question. So I guess I could start by clarifying it that I didn't actually propose 31 millimeters per se. I used it as an example of, you know, what you could set it at.
Okay.
And that was based on what at the time, so in the first study on the Vaporfly 4%, the one that was done at the University of Colorado, in the study, they reported that the thickness of the shoe was 31 or 32 millimeters, whatever it was. So I think they reported 31 millimeters. So it said, let's use that as an example, because this is what the shoe is at, cap it at that. And then similarly, you know, Nike commercially had reported that the Vaporfly 4% was 31 millimeters. So that was kind of why we went with that, that number, just because that's what was out at the time. If you actually take a measurement on any of them, I think the commercial 4% was thicker than that at its heel, at its maximum thickness. And then certainly by the time the editorial actually went to press, the next percent had come out and that was even thicker. So I used the 31 millimeters just purely because that was the number that was on the shoe that was available at the time. My main goal or hope was actually not so much of any specific one number, but rather just to pick a number, just use that as a criteria. And because, I mean, inevitably with sports, any rule that we make in sports is relatively arbitrary. It's nice to have some sort of meaning behind why we make it, but like, an example that I use a lot is like football pitches. Like, they're going to be, I think the FIFA rule is like 80 to 120 meters or something like that. But it's like at some point in the 1800s, they decided that the meaningful size of a football pitch was going to be right around 100 meters long. So that was my thing with this was more so like, let's just pick a number and then move on. And that's the best way to do it. So 40 millimeters, is it too generous? It certainly allows more, there's more performance gain to be had, I think, than if it were to be 31 millimeters. So you certainly invite more of an advantage in. Moreover, it does create more space for optimization within that. So you can put different geometries, because the other idea is like the thicker and thicker you get that shoe, the more you can fit things in that three-dimensional space to really augment the benefits of, if you have like a foam or something like that. Now, that being said, this is maybe another can of worms to open up, but like, it's also not something that if some is good, more is better. So if 40 millimeters, you could make a better shoe than if it was 30 millimeters. There's not going to be a shoe that's 1 meter thick that's going to be super advantageous for running. There is an optimality somewhere in there, but getting there is really tricky business. And it becomes, I think, the bigger and bigger it gets, the more and more individualized it gets. So by the more and more you reduce it, the more you reduce variation in advantage as well. So I think that trying to strike a balance. 40 millimeters, there is going to be more of a performance advantage to be had and more individual variation. But overall, happy that we at least set a limit.
Yeah. And do you think that just setting a limit on the stack height is appropriate, or sorry, the midsole thickness is appropriate, or do we need to be setting limits on what's actually in the shoe in terms of carbon plates, spikes, those kind of things? Or does that just constrain the sport in an artificial manner?
Yeah, so another great question. My hope with the thickness limit was that you wouldn't have to limit anything within there. So the idea that you could create kind of this geometric constraint and then do whatever you want within that to optimize the shoe. Because there are a couple of reasons why I think we don't want to be setting specific limits on architecture within shoes. It's kind of an easy philosophical exercise, and like, well, we don't want lots of stuff in there, but it's like, okay, now try and nail down a specific way to articulate that and then test it. So it's like, well, we don't want multiple plates or certain geometries of plates or things like that. Well, it's like, okay, well, now we have to set up some sort of explicit definition of what's allowed and what's not, and then a testing protocol, and then some sort of group to test it. So now we've created all of these kind of operational structures, and then beyond that, it's like, do we want to be dissecting shoes or putting them in CT scanners or something like that? It's tricky business. So again, my hope was that if you create a reasonable thickness limit, it kind of takes care of itself in the sense that you're not going, at some point, you're not going to have the literal and figurative space to do, crazy things with the shoe. And moreover, anything that you do with it, you are really going to be relatively constrained to the extent that they could affect performance. So we actually saw that with the Alpha Fly. So for anybody watching that's not familiar, that was the kind of Nike's latest iteration of all of this, where they put AirPods underneath the front of the shoe in a very thick heel, and then of course there's a plate going through it. That shoe might look a little different if we were allowed to be thicker, because all of those kind of unique, strange architectural pieces in it, without a super big space, you can't, you're limited by the way you can move the plate. You can, position the plate through it, how those AirPods can kind of interact with their position in the shoe, their size, things like that. I think, again, it's a reasonable thickness limit. And if we go the other way, if you were to make the limit like 20 millimeters or something like that. The geometry of that plate might not even be that important, or, you know, for some people, they might not even need a plate in there. So yeah, the idea that the thickness limit really kind of takes care of, I think it takes care of the architectural features itself. And I think the other limits, because World Athletics did add in a rule about the number of plates that can be in there, and they can't be on different planes, which is like, I won't go into it, but that's a convoluted rule that's like, it's already seen lots of, I guess, examples of kind of inconsistencies in the enforcement. So I think that's kind of a superfluous rule. The thickness limit is really kind of what is a good governor.
So you said about individual variances with the thicker sole. Have you found that there's responders and non-responders to the technology, and what sort of runners would respond best to the carbon plated shoes, and which runners may not respond that much?
Yeah, so one of the things that, you know, jumped out in the original studies that were published was the range and response. Now, I would say there are two things going on. There aren't necessarily, we haven't seen evidence of non-responders per se. We've just seen varying levels of response. And what I mean by that is they're beneficial for just about everybody. But the amount of benefit varies a little bit. So in, again, the first study that looked at runners at 4 different speeds and tested them in 3 different shoes, the average running economy benefit in the new Nike shoes was 4%, and hence the name of the shoe. And the range was about 2% to 6%. So you do see that variance. Now, again, that gets back to the idea that everybody benefits, but some people have a little bit more of a benefit. And the people that do this becomes a pretty tricky question, subject to a lot of speculation. I'll give you my thoughts and kind of some of those stuff that they found in there. You know, they found that doing kind of a subgroup analyses, that they didn't set out to study this, but they found that within I think they had 18 runners who did these, you know, myriad trials. They were split. They had about half and half, forefoot strikers and rear foot strikers, or midfoot, forefoot, and rear foot. And they found that the rear foot strikers benefited more, in the sense that it was closer to 5%. And the forefoot strikers were like 3.5% maybe. So there is some thought that people who are heel striking in the shoes might benefit more. Why that is, I would say I could give like maybe 2 big speculations. One, you might take advantage of more of that foam. So if you have 40 millimeters in the heel, or in those shoes, 32 millimeters, but maybe only 24 in the forefoot, you could store more strain energy in there. And so like there is the idea that you might have a little bit better recycling of energy by basically loading a bunch of energy and getting it back in the shoe. So heel strikers might benefit on that front. The other thing that could also be going on with the heel strikers is they, like, the way the plate coordinates their foot through the foot strike might be maybe more beneficial for some of them. But then the interesting piece is that a subsequent follow-up study found almost like a inverse finding to that, in the sense that they looked at contact time and found that runners with shorter and shorter contact time, so runners who spend less time on the ground, had more of a benefit. And why that's a little bit conflicting is typically we think of forefoot strikers as having very short contact times. And this other study did not find that relationship with contact time. So we've seen kind of some noisy explanations on who benefits and who doesn't. And I could tell you, maybe just from personal experience running them, I think there are just a lot of complexities in the shoe between the actual nature of the foam and its benefit, which is, I mean, it's beneficial on several fronts, not just the fact that it has this high energy return, but it's super soft as well. So that's one of the benefits, is not just how much it bounces back, but how much it actually just compresses down. It's much softer than other shoes, and it's so light. So there are like, those are three big qualities that different people are going to take to them differently. And that's not even getting into the uniqueness of the plate architecture and how that interacts with people. So I think there is this kind of like myriad web of factors that change how different people interact with it. And I think really, I mean, to kind of pull it all together, different people respond to being barefoot differently than shoes. So like if all three of us go out and run barefoot on the grass together, it's going to be very different for each of us based on different characteristics of our gait, our feet, our, you know, our limbs, our musculature, our strength, all of those things. So as soon as you put shoes on, we have a big difference in response. Now it's the same thing with these augmented shoes. We kind of shifted again.
I guess we're kind of interested from someone watching the Olympics, and a lot of the technologies are now getting into the spikes, which you predicted quite early on this year. When I listened to you on the Let's Run podcast, and I found that was a very interesting listen. What do you think the spikes are doing to track running in terms of the improvements, and for an event like the 1500 meters, for example, how much time benefit are they giving?
Yeah, so that's like the $1 million question that everybody wants to peg a number down on. I think it's similar to the aspect that you know, with the shoes of like kind of this range of individual response. You definitely see that with the spikes, where it's different people are going to respond to them differently. If so I can walk you through a couple different lines of reasoning on how we could estimate a benefit. But I'll just tell you, when I watch the races, in the back of my mind, I kind of have it pegged around, I would say 2-ish to 2.5 seconds is kind of what I'm thinking in my head for an elite men's 1500. And I think that could, you know, the range there could be, you know, high 1 seconds, like 1.8 up to close to 3 seconds, maybe for some people. So I think it's hovering right around that number. And that's kind of, again, what I'm thinking when I'm watching them. And so, you know, where that benefit comes from, and kind of how I would say using kind of grounding myself in that estimation. So we have a couple things we can look at. One is the nature of the spikes, is like the dragonfly spike. So that's the common one that we see in the distance events. So, you know, you have Nike really has two spikes out right now. They have the Dragonfly, which is very similar to the road shoe. It's just the Pebax foam, so it's this really good super foam with a stiff plate through it. It's not carbon fiber. It's actually, to be really confusing, it's Pebax, which is essentially a plastic version of that foam, or rather, the foam is a foamed version of the plastic. So it's a rigid plate through super foam. That's all you really need to know. So it's that same ingredient, it's just much thinner. So it's not, whereas the road shoe is, you know, anywhere from, you know, 38, 40 millimeters, whatever. The track spike is actually, you can get into the limits later, but I don't think it's even 20 millimeters. It's actually still thin, but much thicker than previous track spikes. So they have the Dragonfly, and then they have the Zoom Victory, which is kind of a middle distance spike, which has the AirPod underneath the forefoot. And that one is, I would actually say there are kind of those are two very different mechanical interactions going on. So the Dragonfly seems to be similar to the road shoe, that it's like pretty beneficial for most runners who are in it. The level of benefit varies. The Victory is I think it's much more constrained in its benefit. Some people are not going to like running in that at all. Some people might benefit from it. To add more complexity, some people might need to train in it to get the benefit from it. But again, another can of worms. So looking at just the Dragonfly, the simpler case, there was actually a really cool study done here at a university in the state of Michigan, here at Grand Valley State University. They looked at the Vaporfly road shoe compared to the Nike Matumbo track spike. So which was more energetically beneficial? And the road shoe, the Vaporfly road shoe, was 2.7% more efficient than the track spike. And they ran on a Woodway treadmill, which has those rubberized slats, so you could run in spikes on it. So I thought that was a very kind of clever experiment. But what that tells me is I look at that and I'm like, okay, the benefit of the Dragonfly, you don't have nearly as much foam as in the shoe, but it's also much lighter. So I think that it might be easy, to do, I would call like a napkin extrapolation, to think like, okay, it's much lighter, so it's more beneficial on that front, but not nearly as much as that super beneficial foam. So I would say net a little bit less beneficial than that 2.7% to running economy. So even if it's 2 or 2.25% or something like that, the benefit to the speed might then be looking somewhere on the order of 1.5% benefit in your speed. And so over, a 1500, that's 1500 is going to be 200 seconds, right? 210 seconds is 330. So 1.5% on that is 3 seconds. So like I said, I think, if it's 1 to 1.5%, 2 to 3 seconds. So I think that's where I've kind of ballparked it. A lot of factors might change that, but I think broadly speaking, if we look at the way performances have shifted, that kind of feels about where it's at. Now, the complex layer added onto that is actually the other piece that we don't have a lot of good data on. We have maybe some small data points on the road, but what it does to your muscular system in terms of the burden and cost and damage of actually running at those speeds and forces on a hard track. I suspect, and others have postulated the same thing, one of the substantial benefits of these is not just that they make you more efficient running forward, it's that they change the mechanical burden of running, in that they lessen some of that kind of, I would say, the traumatic cost of running. Anybody who's run a 10K on the track in spikes knows that there is a substantial traumatic cost to your body running in spikes. And I think these spikes change that. And why that's important in the 1500, I think it can change how athletes might move through rounds, which will affect championships. And then also the same thing with I think there's a benefit to be had in the steeplechase on that front, similar to what you see in the marathon of lessening the load on the body. And then also certainly the longer distance bends. Last thing I'll say on the spikes, one of the really tricky things to studying them in the lab, as opposed to studying the road shoes, the speeds that athletes race at are on the track are above your lactate threshold. And so why that's tricky is all of these things that we've studied in the lab, especially, the canonical measurement we take is your oxygen consumption. And so that's the benefit, the benefit that's measured in the shoes that we all know about is the improvement in running economy, lowering the amount of oxygen that you need to run at a given speed. Those only hold underneath your lactate threshold where it's predominantly aerobic metabolism. As soon as you go above that, those things change. However, I think it's actually an open question of whether or not there's more or less benefit to anaerobic metabolism in those spikes, in terms of how they change your muscular dynamics. So I say all of that just to highlight that it's trickier to study them on the track than in the lab at slower speeds.
Well, I'm certainly looking forward to running a 10K. I've run 10K around the track in a pair of traditional spikes, and I know how it feels when you afterwards. And
it's actually, I will say to that, one of the interesting things on these spikes is I've long argued that most athletes maybe save some of the absolute top, very efficient, maybe 27-minute 10K runners. Most athletes probably would, even in shoes of old, probably would have benefited from racing 10Ks in very, very light racing flats, as opposed to track spikes with no cushioning. And the reason that that's true, that these spikes kind of like have introduced by proxy, is our bodies like a little bit of cushioning for running. Like a little bit of cushioning at the cost of even a tiny bit of weight is actually energetically beneficial. So I think even shoes of old that don't have this super foam, as long as you have a super, super light foam, like racing flats, I think for most people would have been more beneficial for longer distances. I think these spikes have just kind of forced the issue a little bit. But now they've made it super beneficial because it's even better foam. So, I mean, what's interesting is the New Balance spikes have actually been out about as long as the Nike spikes. People just haven't really, because New Balance is, I would say, not as big on the global stage, in the sense that like they're not on the feet of a lot of East Africans that are, crushing the fastest times that we see. But if you look at like, El Purrier here has been running crazy fast times since the beginning of 2019, and she was in those spikes. So their spikes have been performing well for a while. They were, I would say, the first company to respond with track spikes well. And they did so on a very similar time scale to Nike. So the New Balance has been doing well on that front for sure. Other companies, I would say the foam, in terms of the foams, we could kind of break down the road shoes and the spikes. There have been other companies that have, I would say, certainly gotten close on the foams, with, I would say, Adidas. Their Light Strike Pro foam is good. One of my criticisms of them is they haven't told us what the materials are for it, so we can't make, I would say, educated scientific analyses of it, apart from the performance stuff that we see or tests we might do in the lab now. New Balance has a good foam as well. And then Saucony, I would commend Saucony, especially. They were the first company to, or actually I will take that back, Reebok used Peebacks for a while, but Saucony was the first company to come out with a super shoe that really followed the form of the Vaporfly, of using a Peebacks foam with a rigid plate in it. And those have performed really well. I've had the New Balance shoes in our lab on like a mechanical testing machine to measure the properties compared to the Vaporfly. And I'd say it doesn't have quite as favorable properties in terms of like the energy return, but or even the compliance. It's not quite as soft and doesn't quite return as much energy, but it's still much softer than a traditional flat, and it's still lighter. So I think it definitely moves the dial quite a bit. And I haven't brought the Adidas shoe in yet to do those same tests, but I think broadly speaking, it's pretty similar on that front. So I think if I'm an athlete on the line, I think I like in my upcoming races, I'll be racing in the Vaporfly. I think it's still probably, by my estimation, certainly the best. I don't think for some people, they may be roughly equivocal. Other people, there may be a discrepancy, but I would say there are still some features of it that are still best in class. But the other companies have definitely moved up, if not equal, very, very close, which is good. On the spikes, New Balance was the first one to have, spikes that were doing really well, and they've been doing that for a while. Adidas has 2 spikes out now that I think are comparable, especially their longer distance spike. And then I would say actually the companies that I'm very curious and excited for are New Balance has a next generation of spikes that'll be coming out that are even thicker. And then ASICS is doing the same thing. And then I think Saucony has one in the works as well. And why I say that is, I mentioned this earlier with regards to the spikes, is that the limits for World Athletics are 25 millimeters for the distance events. The Dragonfly, their distance spike is not even 20 millimeters. So there's still, if you think the amount of foam could be beneficial, there's actually still a lot of room, again, literally and figuratively, to work with in terms of adding stuff in there. And I think Saucony, they have, I saw a patent that they put out, and then subsequently I've just seen some of their athletes racing in these. Saucony has a thicker shoe. Asics has a thicker spike that that is beyond 20 millimeters, that is, now approaching 25 millimeters. And then New Balance has one that is a prototype as well. So those three companies are the first ones to make moves on having a substantial amount of foam. That I think it's a very interesting piece that I should maybe put this out online to get a discussion going. But like, we criticized Nike when a lot of this stuff first came out, because a lot of the times the shoes weren't available. And so it was like, come on, like, you're making these shoes, they're not available, they could be beneficial for your athletes and not others. I would say these other companies are in that case now. If I'm racing a 10K on the track, I don't want the Dragonfly, I want Asics spike, or I want New Balance's spike, or I want, Adidas's that might be a little bit thicker, and you can't get them. So I think that, the tables might have turned on that front. Be interesting to see how kind of they respond. But I certainly think with respect to the spikes, I think we're seeing more of a level playing field maybe than, yeah. I like where we're at with the spikes, and I think there are a lot of options for athletes. Well, there's a lot of brands out there. It's still, for any athlete, without a ticket to Tokyo, it's a little bit harder to get some of these. But
we tend to work with a lot of novice and recreational runners, and I guess one of the questions we get from time to time is, should these runners be wearing super shoes? And in terms of super shoes, should we just be wearing them all the time now?
Good question. I would hedge towards no, in terms of wearing them all the time. Wearing them sometimes, yes. One of my kind of golden rules actually is like mixing up the surfaces on which you run, the shoes being one of those surfaces. So I actually think that peppering in use of a super shoe is beneficial for most athletes, in the sense of, that foam forces your body to interact with the ground a little bit differently. I think it does kind of save some of that muscular trauma, which could be really beneficial for some athletes, but could also allow you to do some different types of work, or different types of running that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do. So I think there is certainly that benefit. Now, if you ran in them every day, there could be issues that come up with, just being in a really, really thick maximalist shoe like that. There is some evidence coming out that, you're going to subject your body to higher forces, because, well, maybe that's actually maybe not the case with the super shoes because they give more energy back, but like really thick shoe like Hoka, you're going to lose a lot of energy when you land on the shoe. So there have been studies that show that you load your body a little bit more. But I think with a super shoe that has really resilient foam, we haven't seen forces increase so much. But I would say that you're still going to have kind of I don't want to say maybe unstable platform that you're on, but the way that your foot is interacting with the shoe in the ground habitually day in, day out on that very squishy foam with this very rigid plate within it. I think doing that every day, again, just anecdotally, but I suspect that could be too much of one thing that should not be done. So I think using them intermittently in training could be good for most runners, regardless of speed. So I think going into it, every athlete, maybe the tack to take as a practitioner might just be to say, like, something is going to feel weird when you start running in this, like whether or not it manifests as an injury or a tweak or a niggle or something like that, like something is going to change somewhere along your chain. Just be ready for that, dose them in gradually. And when you start to feel something different, like then, be cautious. So I think just going in with the hypothesis that there might be something that flares up initially. Wherever it is, we don't know. Or, I mean, it really is kind of an experiment of one for each person. So I think maybe taking that tack. The other thing that I will say about using them is one of the exciting things is elements of these shoes are, I would say, trickling down into other aspects of footwear. So like Saucony now is using that foam in just normal shoes, like without a carbon plate. That's a shoe that I've been doing a lot of my training in, and I love it. I think it's an awesome training shoe. Other companies have used, like Puma has used some of their foams, not their absolute elite foams, but some of their kind of softer, more compliant foams in some of their training shoes. And so we're seeing these shifts of foam, which is, I mean, running was long overdue for that. EVA is terrible. I mean, it's a little extreme, but like it's just not, it's so suboptimal in the sense that it breaks down quickly, it breaks down regionally in the shoes. So having shoes that are softer, lighter, and maybe more, sturdier, last longer, that's a great thing. Absolutely a great thing.